I guess she heard of me somehow. She may have had the misfortune of reading my blog or my book. But when Betty did get in touch with me, I don't think that Betty knew at that time that I'm actually your cousin. That I'm not sure that Betty knew at all that I was related to the Olmsteds. She brought me here to speak about the Olmsteds, Gideon and Esther, and their journey here and a little bit of the history. But she wasn't aware that Gideon and Esther are my fourth great-grandparents. So, yeah, and that's through Sally. So I am a fourth great-grandson of Philemon and Abigail Wright, and I'm also a fourth great-grandson of Gideon and Esther Olmsted. Being a historian, I was going to be thanking all kinds of counselors and the mayor. They send their best wishes, but because I invited them only 3 weeks ago, their schedules are very busy as usual, and they send their regrets. They would have loved to have been here, particularly given the weather, but they could not be here with us because this is the interesting thing. As I said, Liz got in touch with me. She had been told about Philemon and Abigail, my descendants. She had read my blog and whatnot, but she wasn't aware of the fact that Gideon and Esther were my great-grandparents, fourth great-grandparents, and she was surely not aware of the fact that I had only recently been doing a deep dive into the history of Bellevue Cemetery. And the reason behind that is because, as most things happen here in Aylmer, I don't know if any of you have read my book, but I'm really all about the curious history of Wrightstown, Aylmer, Ottawa. And I say curious history because curious history doesn't mean it's fake history. Curious history means emphasis has been put on one thing, and some of the things have either dropped off the plate or been forgotten. And that's one of the things about Bellevue Cemetery. Local historians and the people of Aylmer came to be called the Conroy Bellevue Cemetery. So the name is Bellevue Cemetery, and its official name, of course, but most people in Aylmer began to call it the Conroy Bellevue Cemetery. And every time I would do my deep dive into research, I'd always be coming up with the fact that Gideon Olmsted was one of the first people buried here, he and his wife, but that one historian from 1906 said he donated the first plot of land. But the reason why that got sort of mixed up is because the most famous local historian, Diane Aldred, in one of her books said, quite simply, that she thought that Gideon Olmsted, and she knew that Anson Guard had said he donated the first acre of land. But she said, there's a problem because the oldest known burial in the cemetery is 1812. A young girl by the name of Ann Taylor. She was 12 years old. Her headstone is right there. So that little white headstone right there is Ann Taylor's headstone. The sun is shining on it beautifully right now. And when it shines obliquely like that, you can actually read it very, very clearly. So anytime you're looking in an old cemetery, bring a flashlight with you if you're looking at old headstones. If you shine, look at Simon here. So if you were here at 8 o'clock in the morning, you could barely read that. So the history had been that Ann Taylor was buried in 1812. Diane, who was a meticulous researcher, obviously didn't go to the primary source. What had been written in the history was 1812. She read the book. She didn't actually go to the headstone. So while I was doing my deep dive, I thought, there's no way that in 1906, the famous historian Anson Guard would get it wrong about who donated the land. So I came here, I had a spray bottle with water, I had a flashlight, and I knelt down and I dug the grass away from the bottom of the headstone, and I cleaned the headstone off of all the moss and everything else, shined the light obliquely. Sure enough, 1842, not 1812. And you can barely see the carving of the four, but the spacing tells you, first of all, that it had to be, but also the bare carving with the light and the water made me realize that that was. So then I went looking for the oldest. And the oldest is little Anna Heath. Anna Heath over here in the Maltese cross, her headstone was at one point taken up from her, because those are the scattered headstones. And Anna Heath was buried in 1830. Those dates, given that Ann Taylor is now 1842, and Anna Heath is the oldest known burial, that reestablished the history that Anson Guard had written. So Gideon Olmsted, he was right. Gideon Olmsted donated this land. He owned this lot number 12, the first half, the western half of lot number 12 that goes all the way down to the river. And this 1 acre was what Gideon had donated. So from this day forward, historically one could say that the name of the cemetery, there are many who own this cemetery, so you could add all their names. There's the Conroys, there's the Stewarts, and so on. But the donation of the land was by Gideon. So if anything, if one has to add a name to Bellevue Cemetery, it should be the Olmsted Bellevue Cemetery. And I certainly am writing it that way. I'm certainly promoting it that way, not to erase anybody else's history. But once you add 5 other names to it, people say you're getting ridiculous. So the point though being that Mary Conroy, she added to the acre. She was the one who created all the rest of the cemetery. So her name should certainly be remembered. But Gideon should never be forgotten. That's the main thing. So I was doing that deep dive in the history of the cemetery, but I'd like to read to you now, if I may, just the updated history of the Bellevue Cemetery and how exactly this plot of land, this 1 acre of land, came to be. This settlers' burial grounds that became cemeteries are the Leamy family burial ground, right by Lake Leamy. It's now known as Notre Dame Cemetery. The first known settler burial in that cemetery is 1809. Then there is the Eastern Burial Ground, now St. James Cemetery. The first known burial is in 1821. And the Western Burial Ground, now Bellevue, first known burial 1830. Now, I'm very careful to say first known burial, because Diane Aldred said she had a primary document that first mentions the Western Burial Ground in 1822. So Liz invites me. I'm doing a deep dive in the history. 3 weeks before we're about to gather, I came to this is why the mayor and the councillors were invited. This is the 200th anniversary of the Gideon Olmsted Burial Ground. And we are here to celebrate that 200th anniversary. Something that no one knew until 3 weeks ago. And I'm looking at my papers and I go, what? So that's serendipity, to say the least. From 1802 until 1806, Bellevue Cemetery's land belonged to Philemon Wright Jr., who then conveyed the land back to his father, Philemon Sr., in 1806. In 1808, Gideon Olmsted bought the land, and then sometime in 1822, according to Diane Aldred, Gideon donated the first acre of land to create the burial ground, which was later to be used by the 3 Aylmer Protestant churches. Gideon called it the Upper Cemetery, the Lower Cemetery being St. James in Wrightstown, but most people called it, back then, the Olmsted Cemetery, and that from Anson Guard. When it was enlarged by the Conroy family, Robert and Mary, it became the Olmsted Conroy Cemetery, and then sometime before Anson Guard writes the history in 1906, the Stewart family gave it the name Bellevue Cemetery. Gideon and his wife Ester Andrews, now her name is spelled Andrews, E-W-S, but the whole family spelled it A-N-D-R-U-S. And her family goes back at least five to six generations in the United States of Andrews, spelled A-N-D-R-U-S. So it is likely that she herself spelled the name D-R-U-S. Now, Sally donates the stone. Was Sally the one who gave the inscription to the carver? Was it Sally? I don't know. but that it is spelled Drews is quite simply, if you go to so many headstones in this cemetery and others, particularly the older ones, you will see some terrible spellings of names, and names that you look at and you say, that can't be, because I know that my family spelt it one way or the other. I was just talking to Eric about the fact that Olmsted here is spelled E-A-D.
Yeah.
His father, Jabez, spelled his name S-T-E-D. So here in Aylmer, all my life, I've known that there are Olmsteds who, quite frankly, think that they're not related to each other, because some are S-T-E-D and others S-T-E-A-D. And the problem is, quite frankly, is that they themselves may not have been familiar with the history, and they simply looked at the names and said, well, I've seen the headstone of my father and it's not E-A-D, so I guess he's not related to Gideon, when likely they are. And not likely, but most assuredly they are, particularly if they're here at the Bellevue Cemetery, the Olmsted Bellevue Cemetery. So Gideon and his wife Ester Andrews are both buried here, along with many children and descendants, relatives of us all. After Gideon's death on May 14, 1837, Lot 12 was split up into parcels of 30 acres by the 10 Olmsted children and sold to Mary McConnell's brothers, William McConnell and Jonathan McConnell. A piece was also sold to Thomas Roberts. Mary McConnell married Robert Conroy, and she eventually bought the cemetery and 3 adjacent lots with a view to enlarge the cemetery from 1869 to 1872. The large Conroy Cemetery plot was established in 1872 and in 1873. Mary sold her first cemetery lot to the Church family. The new cemetery was laid out by Bolton McGrath in 1884. The Conroy family continues to hold the cemetery in the family's hands, managed by Mary's sons, Robert and William, until 1902, when it was sold to Samuel Stewart, who operated it until his death in 1919, at which time it is inherited by son W.H. Stewart. In 1945, Reverend Archie Castleman, minister of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, established the Bellevue Cemetery Company to ensure its continued use by the Protestant community of Hull, Erdley, and Aylmer. It is directed by the 3 churches of Aylmer and 2 directors. The company purchased the cemetery from W.H. Stewart in 1945. So historically, one could say the cemetery should be referred to as the Olmsted, McConnell, Conroy, Stewart, Robert Cemetery. Today, however, it is simply called the Bellevue Cemetery. And on this 200th anniversary, allow me to say, from here on forward, the Olmsted Bellevue Cemetery. And their journey here, the family hails from Ware, Massachusetts, which is just below the Boston Harbor. And Philemon Wright, of course, comes from Woburn, which is above the Boston Harbor, up by the Mystic River. So did they know each other? Did Philemon Wright know Gideon back in Massachusetts? I am going to say likely they did. Very likely they did. The population of Woburn at that time was about 600 people. So it gives you an idea of just how small the communities were. Boston only numbered in a few thousand. So if you were a miller and a carpenter, you probably had business all over the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So I'm going to say it's very likely that Gideon knew Philemon Wright. And how Gideon ends up here is quite simply that he and his father and his brothers and sister all established themselves around Burritt's Rapids, just south of Ottawa. And they had established themselves in 1795. And then Philemon Wright comes up here, and I'm compressing this history greatly. Philemon Wright comes up here to create essentially an agricultural community, an independent agricultural community where one could say that all of the farmers would be working together to create a settlement based on agriculture. So the idea that Philemon Wright came up here to cut timber is not at all the case. But why cut timber? Well, as every farmer knew back then, that every farmer was as good an axeman as he was a plowman, because every farmer had to clear their land, and they had to know what to do with the wood once they had cleared the land to create potash and lime and mortar and all kinds of things that they would need. So Philemon Wright comes up here, begins his settlement in 1800, and Gideon and Ester arrive here probably sometime around 1802. So the time period, the likeliest time period when they arrive is 1802 to 1804. Gideon, at first, in 1806, is assigned a piece of land, a 200-acre parcel of land, right at the very mouth of the Gatineau River, on the eastern shore of the Gatineau River. So it's lot 28 of what is called the Long Point Range. That's what the settlers called it. It was a bit of a peninsula that no longer exists because there's no water behind. It's all been filled in. But the Long Point Range is where the name Point Gatineau comes from. Now, the name Gatineau, as we all know, is spelled Gatineau. Everyone at the time of Philemon Wright, up to the time of Colonel By, spelt it either Gateno or Gatteno. And the reason for that is because they heard the name first, phonetically. They only heard it. It was never written. There are no documents that show that the name Gatineau, and I've done a deep dive in the research, and this has been verified by a jury of historians as well as the Toponymy Commission of Quebec, that the history is now that the name Gatineau does not come from a fur trader named Nicolas Gatineau, because his name was actually Nicolas Gastineau de Duplessis. So his name was actually not Gatineau. And it was a name that was basically attached to the river by a terrific storyteller / historian, but far more storyteller than historian, who said, well, it must be named after Nicolas Gatineau because he's the only one in Canada who had that name. So it must be named for a Frenchman. So he invented the history. The name actually comes from the Algonquin name, Tena Gatineau. So when Philemon heard it, and other settlers heard it, and then Colonel By is writing it, and people like John McTaggart, and people like Theodore Davis, who was a surveyor and the Surveyor General of Lower Canada, the first time they ever write the name, it is not the name as we see it today. So Gideon has his home at Long Point Range in 1806, but he quickly conveys that land back to Philemon Wright because the way the settlement is going to develop, contrary to what they thought at first, is instead of being up the Gatineau River, it was going to be west of the Chaudière Falls. So the settlement began to grow right along this trail, all the way to Aylmer. And Gideon was one of the first settlers. He can easily be, along with James McConnell, because they were the first two settlers, one on one side of the Rivermead Road, which was then called the McConnell Road, and James McConnell on the other side of the Rivermead Road. They were the first two settlers of Deschênes. So, who were the founders of Deschênes? Given Gideon's contributions of the cemetery and a mill, possibly, and James McConnell's contribution of a mill, Deschênes was literally, we can say, the first settlers, and the founding of Deschênes is likely in their hands. So there's that Gideon has to the history of the Outaouais. And then Gideon Gideon had at that time bought 200 acres right here. So lot 13 was the 200 acres. Then there's 100 acres here, of which he donated this 1 acre. And then lot 10, so one more lot over, all the way to the river. At one point, later on, he buys that lot as well. And that was his massive farm, when you think 300 acres here in the settlement. Gideon Olmsted went on with being a major contributor in Philemon Wright's settlement. When Philemon Wright decides to send a timber raft, the first timber raft, down to Quebec City, there are 6 names that are associated with the contract of putting together all the wood, cutting the wood, milling the wood, getting it ready for the trip down in 1805. One of the 6 names is Gideon Olmsted. When Philemon Wright builds his mills in 1802, Gideon Olmsted, we're not sure he was living here at the time, but he certainly was on the Rideau River. Gideon Olmsted was the carpenter who built his mills, and Gideon contributed to the milling. So he participated in, at first, running the mill as well. So, and later on, when the militia is formed in 1809, Gideon Olmsted becomes captain of the Hull militia at one point. So those are the very, very direct and very substantial contributions of Gideon Olmsted. And I would say that certainly an unsung hero of the first settlement of the Ottawa Valley. And there it is. You're saying Philemon Wright?
No, but
No, you mean Olmsted. Yeah.
Olmsted.
Olmsted, thank you.
Yeah.
Because you said Philemon Wright, and then I suddenly put it into Central Park. So Frederick Law Olmsted and Jabez, Captain Jabez, so Gideon's grandfather, great-grandfather, Captain Jabez, his father, as best we know, and we don't know directly, is Moses Olmsted. We don't know the name of Captain Jabez's mother. Captain Jabez, Moses Olmsted hails from Massachusetts, hails from Connecticut, and his family comes from Essex. That history we do know of Moses. So Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, has exactly the same genealogy, although not a link that I could find or others have been able to find. So are they the same family? Most assuredly they are. I can't say they absolutely are, but most assuredly they are. There is a genealogical link, but it hasn't been directly found yet.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
What's that?
That's your next project.
Oh my goodness. I've been trying. I have, particularly in the last 3 weeks, furiously. Yes. Yes?
How much in today's dollars would a plot of land cost if you come in here and bought a big piece of land?
This is the crazy thing, is that I wanted to know exactly what, like Philemon Wright is said to have brought 20,000 pounds with him here.
Wow.
So that's what he sold his land. He and his brother sold their land in Woburn, and that's what they brought with them. So I thought, well, in today's money, that's going to be, I don't know, $5, $6, $7 million, right? Wow. Here's the thing, is that inflation only starts racing in the 1900s. So when you're looking at the early 1800s, you only multiply by 40. Like one would think, if you're multiplying by 20 in 1950, say, or 1920, well, it's got to be you multiply by 200 back in 1800. It doesn't work that way. So a plot of land. Now, here's the curious thing also about the way Philemon made the settlement. A lot of people think, well, Philemon Wright was a rich man, but he only arrived here with $800,000 in today's money. How many mills and cement manufactories, and how much can you build with $800,000 in today's dollars? It's not a lot. But the way Philemon's settlement worked was there weren't a lot of transactions made for money. So when Gideon Olmsted arrived, he built Philemon's mills. Was that how he paid for his land completely? Could be. We don't know, because there's no actual, the deed doesn't say what was transferred. And in many ways, many people came here, particularly when the timber industry started, that there were plots of land. Philemon, at one point, well, when he dies, he owns 39,000 acres in various townships. So it's a huge amount. It's 17,000 alone here in Hull Township. So he had a lot of land to give. But when somebody arrived to clear 200 acres, which is what they wanted, particularly on the river if they could, and probably moving much more up towards Bristol and Bristol Township and Eardley Township, what Philemon did is he said, okay, I'll give you the land, everything you clear on that land, you make rafts, you float it down to me, you bring me the wood. And then for 5 years, I want, like a quarter of your wheat production, and so on. So there was a bartering system that went on. So Philemon Wright was, of course, selling that wood, so he'd then make money. But the timber industry was horrible for making money. You went from riches to rags. Within John Egan, the most famous person, the lumber baron that built Aylmer, for instance, he was all the way up the Madawaska, all the way up the Ottawa River. He was selling all kinds of money, a very rich man. Until one year, the timber price came down, and the next year, so in 2 years, John Egan was bankrupt. And that's the thing, that the industry here was, this was a wilderness. So you didn't go to Walmart with your money. So money didn't mean a lot necessarily. What meant a lot was what you owned and what you operated and how people were doing trade with you. So that's why so many historians have wrongfully said, well, Philemon Wright was a terrible money manager because he was practically bankrupted, on several occasions. Well, no, this was a wilderness, and he built things from scratch, as did Gideon Olmsted, as did Elisha Sheffield, and James McConnell. And so were they rich men? They had property. They created their industry, and they lived good lives. But they were certainly not J.R. Booth. J.R. Booth arrives in this area in 1853. The timber industry is well on its way. So now he's making money hand over fist on lumber, something that the Wright brothers and the Wright son couldn't do. So Gideon lived a very peaceful, quiet existence here on the Aylmer Road, and he and Esther raised their children as a farmer, and he was very involved in his community. And one could say property-wise and maybe money, I have no idea. But was he a wealthy man? Certainly if you were to compare him to, let's say, the workers in the area, absolutely he was. Yes?
Can you speak around the time of Gideon? I'm thinking especially about Philemon Wright Jr.
Sarah. So Sally, as she was known. So have all of you been to the Bytown Museum?
Yes.
So if you've never been to the Bytown Museum, or if you went there and you didn't know, Sally's picture, her portrait, is on the 3rd floor of the Bytown Museum.
They don't have a name tag on her or anything.
Yeah, they do now.
Oh, they do now?
Yeah, oh, they sure do. Yep, I told Grant. Grant Vogel's the curator there. Grant, I know very well, and it was probably about a good 10 years ago that I said, hey, something's got to be done. Because I think the reason they didn't have a name tag at first was because they had lost who had donated it, and they thought she was someone else. Yes, but she is definitely Sally Olmsted. Now Sally Olmsted, who is Gideon and Esther's daughter, she married Philemon Jr. Philemon Jr., the forgotten son of Philemon Wright and Sons. And the reason I say forgotten son is because there were some historians way back when kept seeing Philemon and Philemon Jr. and thought they're the same person. And the reason was Philemon Jr. was doing all the business for his father, and Philemon Jr., his handwriting was atrocious. I have had nightmares trying to. I spent on one letter from Philemon Jr. I spent 3 weeks because there was one part I needed to know. 3 weeks trying to decipher it. So I think all the other historians just gave up. But Philemon Jr. was the eldest son of Philemon and Abigail. When they arrived here, he is 17, just about to be 18. So he's a young man, and he's a very capable young man as a farmer, and he's as skilled as his father in everything that he needed to be skilled in. His next youngest son is Tiberius. So when Tiberius arrives here in 1800, he's only 13. And Ruggles, who lives the longest, was only 5. Now, Ruggles is the Wright that everybody remembers, and everybody says, well, he inherited Philemon Wright and Sons. He was the most important son. No, he survived. Survivors get to write the history. Keep that in mind, everyone. So the thing is that Ruggles also was meticulous in keeping the papers of Philemon Wright and Sons. The archive, the Wright Fond in the National Archives is incredible in its volume. And that's not the only archive from Ruggles Wright. But Philemon Jr. built everything with his father. In fact, historians at first always said that the first farm that Philemon Wright cleared was the Gatineau farm on the banks of the Gatineau River by the shore of Vimy Lake. Philemon Wright Sr. did not clear that farm. He himself, in his 1824 report, credits his son, Philemon Jr., for clearing that farm. And in fact, Philemon Jr. was in charge of and managed all of the Wright farms, the largest of which is right across the street from us. If you go, there's the Allen Road, and everything from here all the way to the Moore Farm was the massive Britannia Farm. And the Britannia Farm was first in the hands of Philemon Jr. 1,600 acres is what it was. So the Royal Ottawa Golf Club, for instance, occupies a part of the Britannia Farm, and it's no more than about, I'm going to say at the most, 600 acres. So when you think of how big the Royal Ottawa Golf Club is, the Britannia Farm is massive. And this road ends up being called the Britannia Road as a result of that farm being there. So Philemon Jr. builds everything with his father, and he manages everything. Once the timber industry starts, Philemon Sr. is spending most of his time in Montreal and Quebec City. So who's managing the business? Philemon Jr. and the First Lady of the Ottawa Valley, Abigail. Abigail Wright, an astounding woman in how much she did and how much we didn't know about Abigail, and how little was written. So I've been able to write the history of Abigail. There's scant texts that are written, but my style of writing is always writing about the relationships and the people, as opposed to just dates, times, and places. So Abigail and Philemon are the two people who, when you ask the question, or others ask the question, like, who built this place? People always say Philemon Sr. It wasn't. It was a family business, and Abigail had every bit a part of building this place. And then we get to Sally. So Sally was probably not, she was probably illiterate. She probably did not write. She probably did not read. There are no documents that I've been able to find where it's written by her hand. Even Abigail, although she wrote and read very well, she rarely wrote her own letters. There's 2 letters that she wrote. All the others were written by others. And what we're looking at is not a practiced hand, like her son Philemon Jr. had not a practiced hand. Philemon Sr. had a very practiced hand, wrote fairly well, and then one historian makes a mistake looking at some of his later letters and says, oh, the man couldn't write. So he probably wasn't very well educated. But Philemon Wright, right here at the Britannia Farm, had an accident where his hand got caught in a thresher. So he couldn't write later in his life because his hand was no longer capable of writing well. So his signature is also really scribbly. But Sally, an industrious woman herself, because Sally runs Gatineau Farm. While Philemon Jr. is creating the Chaudière Lake Farm, which becomes the Chaudière Lake Village, which becomes Aylmer, and he's creating the Britannia Farm, and he's creating the Dalhousie Farm, and he's creating the Columbia Falls Farm, Sally is the farmer. She's the one who is getting the workmen to work, but more interestingly, as far as I'm concerned, she's operating the first distillery. So every settlement has to have a distillery. And if you're out in the wild, you're not going to Montreal to get your your wine and your beer and your rum, necessarily. They did, of course, but those trips were not frequent, and I suspect they went through their beer and their rum pretty quick. And the legends are that, in fact, the Wrights did go through beer and rum very quick. It's been, brought down to the rest of us in our family, but I'm more a Scotch man myself. Did operate, in fact, the first distillery in the area. So their home is built in 1800. The second home is built in 1813. And the third home on the Gatineau farm begins to be built in 1820. And that is the home that actually Andrew Leamy ends up occupying later on, becomes the Leamy farm. But the reason I mention that is because then Sally, in 1820, while the new home is being built, and it's a great big home, Philemon Jr. dies in 1821. He dies from being thrown from a carriage, and he breaks his neck on the road from Grenville to Ottawa, so right outside of Grenville. He was at that time in charge of constructing the new road, the King's Road, that was going to go from Wrightstown to Montreal. The road had only gone to Grenville up to that point. So Sally is left a widow. And as you can imagine, in a town like Wrightstown, where there are very few people, and she has 6 children at that point. Little Ericina is only 2 years old. Sally, not only herself, would be grieving, but she would also be in the need of a husband. She would not necessarily be looking for the first 5 years, but the family would be. And luckily, there was this young man, sparkling young, bright Irish guy from Wexford by the name of Nicholas Sparks, who takes a look at Sally and says, and he's only working for Philemon Senior at that time. He's a clerk and a general handyman, but ends up taking on more and more and more responsibilities and becomes the right-hand man of Philemon Wright and Sons. And he has his eye on Sally and weds her. And at one point, there's a piece of land that comes up for sale on the other side of the river, where there are no settlements. There's only 2 people living on the other side of the river at that time, and one of which is this scoundrel by the name of John Burroughs Honey. And I say scoundrel because he actually drops the name Honey so that nobody can find him, and becomes John Burroughs. And John Burroughs Honey basically flees the area. People are after him, creditors are looking for him, whatnot, and he puts his lot of land up for sale. Well, the first person to hear about it is Philemon Wright. Philemon Wright looks at the land and says, we're looking at rock and cedars, stunted cedars. Why would I want it? So he says, no thanks. Nicholas Sparks, who's working for him, says, hey boss, I need land. I would like to buy the land. And this is just before he marries Sally. He says, I'd like to buy the land. Can you lend me 95 pounds? Philemon Wright lends him the 95 pounds. The rest is history. Nicholas Sparks buys the land that becomes the central part of Ottawa, from all the way from Le Breton Flats to beyond the Rideau Canal, well into the market, just south of the market area. And the richest land, it becomes his wealth, because once they decide to build Bytown, of course, the first land that they're looking at to buy is his land. They actually expropriate part of it, and he and Colonel By they're pretty well almost in fisticuffs. At one point, Nicholas Sparks has to be held back from beating the hell out of Colonel By, because Colonel By won't give him back his land, even though he's not using it for the canal works. So that's part of the story, and Sally is very much a part of the story. And if you go into Ottawa now, of course, Sparks Street is there, but what you might not know is Lion Street, which is, when you look at the 2, I think they're called the memorial buildings, that are pretty well right next to the archives. On the south side of the street, you have these 2 buildings with a big arch over top. That street is called Lion Street. It wasn't always Lion Street. And it wasn't named after William Lyon Mackenzie. It was named after a man named Robinson Lyon. who was a very popular hotel keeper at the Exchange Hotel in Ottawa. But before it was called Lion Street, it was Sally Street. Yes, Sally Street, named after Sally. And Sally, I fondly say, when you look at that very stern picture of Sally at the Bytown Museum, she's much older, of course, but you had to hold that pose forever. So you wouldn't necessarily see a smile, and it wasn't the style back then either. So she looks very, very stern. And I always say she's so stern that you would think that Nicholas would never, ever cross Sally. But we know that Sparks crossed Sally.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.